Did we just lose Michael? No, I think
yes, we're recording.
Okay, great. Good. Well, welcome everyone. So happy to have you here. This is our necessary conversation with Vincent Stanley from Patagonia. We have, I think, very dynamic hour ahead of us. I'm looking forward to it. Again, this is a necessary conversation of the International Humanistic Management Association. These and other necessary conversations are sponsored by the Donahue Center for Business, Ethics, and Social Responsibility at the Manning School of Business at UMass Lowell. We do have a number of these types of events. This is actually, I think, our last necessary conversation until the fall. But we have a number coming up, and if you can see in the chat, and I'll put this back in the chat, there's an event link where you can see things coming up. Next week on Friday, we have a Transforming Business Education with David Sloan Wilson and Michael Pearson. We also have very exciting, our first humanistic management workshop at IECO RCC at Harvard. It's a 3-day workshop coming up May 20th to 22nd. We have Lunch and Learns. Our next Lunch and Learn is on onboarding and developing people with dignity. That's coming up May 24th. And then we have a PhD network with a variety of things going on, the next of which is the reading group. Finally, in May, and May is packed, we have an intellectual shaman conversation with Sandra Waddick coming up along with Bob Quinn. So lots going on. Again, that I'll make sure that link is in the chat. Welcome to everyone. I know some people are joining a little bit later. Again, a reminder that we're recording this necessary conversation. It will be available to all as we package that into something nice for all of you. The chat will also be available. Please do mute your microphones or make sure they're muted. That's bottom left. We will moderate the conversation with Vincent from the chat. So as we go, if you have any questions, comments, remarks, things you'd like to chat about, please do put that in the chat, and when it's time, we'll help moderate that from the chat box. I would like just for a moment to turn it over to Michael Pearson for just a little bit of background if you're less familiar with the Humanistic Management Association, what we're about and what's going on. Michael.
Well, thank you, Erica, and thank you, Vincent, for being on as we're getting more people to join. The International Humanistic Management Association came out of a gathering called the Humanistic Management Network, which came out of conversations of people that were interested, they were in business, that were working in business policy, that were working in academia, and they were all striving and understanding the need for a new paradigm. And we just landed on the term humanistic. And that's then brought conversations forward in terms of what would that paradigm look like. And the two pillars that we have circled on are the protection of dignity and the promotion of well-being or flourishing. And you have similar kind of conversations in many spaces, and they use different labels. And we think that they can be bridged. And regeneration, the framework that Vincent will tell us about, I think is one that lands itself very well in this context. So this is the ambition of the International Humanistic Management Association, to create conversations, foster conversations and collaborations, and professionalize the space. We're working with a number of other universities and other associations in business and in policy to promote this. If you're interested, you can become a member. You can also join these conversations online as you have already. So please let us know and feel free to get more active. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Again, a big welcome to Vincent Stanley of Patagonia. A brief introduction, and I'm not sure how much of an introduction Vincent actually needs, and I can't wait to hear more from you, Vincent. But you've been with Patagonia at least on and off since its very beginning in 1973. I know that you recently co-authored a book with Yvon Chouinard, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, but I was close, I think.
That's right.
Great, called The Responsible Company. And you currently serve as the company's Director of Philosophy, which I'd love to hear more about, as well as you are a resident fellow at the Yale Center for Business and Environment. So welcome. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to have you with us today. And I know everybody's going to have a lot of good questions for you. And if I may, I have a question for you. So I understand that Patagonia has recently changed its mission statement. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that from you, what it was, what it is now, and what the background of that and the story is. And again, we're here, we're just Patagonia, and the topic of today's necessary conversation is Patagonia's road to regeneration. So let's start with the mission statement.
Okay. First, thanks for having me. I think the change in the mission statement speaks to some lessons that we've learned recently in our road. 27, I've been with the company off and on, but mostly on since 1973. And for the first 18 years, we had no mission statement. And I remember when we started to talk about adopting one in 1991, 1992, that I was generally opposed. I don't like mission statements, or I don't like most of them, because I think they tend to be too vague, and they tend to, when you use words like strive in a mission statement or foster, they may be well-meaning, but they can also, they're also words without commitment or accountability. They're words that announce aspiration without saying, we're really going to do this. And the mission statement that we came up with was one that I was actually kind of comfortable with. It was build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, use business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. And it was that second clause that I liked, cause no unnecessary harm.
I love it.
Because yes,
I love it.
It was
shit, I'm supposed to be on a call right now.
It was a concession to the fact that everything we do does create pollution, does create some harm. At the time, I also felt that the mission statement wasn't entirely true. That at that time, we did not know very much about what went on in the supply chain. We hadn't done our work on discovering the intensive use of chemicals in cultivating cotton. We hadn't developed a recycled polyester with our main supplier. So in a way, even though we had that concession, that language was aspirational. But over the past 27 years, what I found is that we actually began over time to inhabit that mission statement, that it became truer rather than less true, that we did start to investigate things done in our name in the supply chain, and then to work with suppliers to make necessary changes. So last year, Yvon, who's now 80, and still comes to the company several hours a day when he's in California, and he started talking and saying, I don't really, we need to change the mission statement. And my first thought was, oh my God, here we go again. I'm not sure now that this mission statement is understood by everyone in the company. It's something that went from aspirational to embodied. Why I joke, don't change a single word. But in fact, we did change it at his behest, and the new mission statement is, we're in business to save our home planet. And when we asked Yvon why the word home, his line was, because I don't want to move to Mars. And that's tongue-in-cheek, but I think it actually reflects the tension going on now between the need to restore nature, to allow nature to restore itself to health, to heal some of our social systems, and the kind of counterbalance of the continual but ever-receding promise of technology to solve those kinds of problems. And I want to talk a little bit about what made this new mission statement possible, because I don't think it would have been possible 10 years ago. I don't think we would have been able to make such a statement or have been bold enough to make it. And what we discovered that's new in the course of business in the last 10 years is we started a little food company called Patagonia Provisions. And initially when we started, we got into this business largely because Evol's always wanted to be in the food business. And we had minor aspirations. We made organic fruit bars, which I don't think anybody has made before. We had a very ambitious program actually to provide salmon, cooked salmon in retort packages, and that we harvested those salmon from the waters of Alaska as they return to their native streams, which is actually the only way you can make sure that you're catching salmon whose stocks are healthy. Because if you catch them in the open ocean, you don't know where they're headed. And we used methods that we had local tribes, native peoples who were using traditional methods to catch the salmon. There's a fellow that we were aligned with for several years. He was a friend named Wes Jackson, who recently turned 80 himself. And it has been his project his life work for the past 50 years to restore the Great Plains to health. He lives in Salina, Kansas. He's an agronomist. And over 20 years ago, he developed a hybrid perennial wheatgrass he called Kernza. Now, to give you, I don't want to wonk out too much, but to give you an idea of what the value of Kernza is, from Wes's point of view, 100 years ago on the Great Plains, the topsoil went from the equivalent of the floor of where I'm sitting now to the ceiling. And it was continually given life by the pounding hooves of buffaloes. That was the equivalent of tillage, moving things around, yet not releasing that carbon into the air, but keeping it in the ground. And so the Kernza that he developed had roots that go 17 feet deep into the ground. And what that does is those roots they actually create soil from dirt because they provide harbor for the microbes and the fungi that actually turn dirt into living soil. It takes nature something like 500 years to create an inch of topsoil. But using regenerative organic methods, you can actually create topsoil much faster than nature can. So Wes told us about this, and he said, oh, well, I invented it 20 years ago, but nobody will grow it. I can't get a farmer to grow it because they tell me, where am I going to sell it? I'm not going to plant something I can't sell. There's no market. So what we did, we worked with him to collaborate with a brewery in Portland, Oregon, and got Whole Foods to sell it in 108 stores on the West Coast. We made a beer out of it. And by doing that, we got the first 200 acres of Kernza planted. And once we did that, a major cereal company was looking at that and said, well, you know, the potential to sequester carbon is so great when you restore soil to health. If we put 3% content into our cereal, we could plant thousands of acres of Kernza. So what this illustrated to us, we're a clothing company Evol's been in business for 60 years, first in the making climbing equipment. We've been in the clothing business for 45 years. And we know that everything we do to mitigate environmental harm is partial. That no matter what we do so far in the apparel business, we're essentially reducing the harm we do rather than giving back to nature as much as we take from her. And the food business has given us a new North Star. The idea that we can, by creating products, actually give back to nature more than we can take. And that is, I think, essentially what regeneration means.
Really, really fascinating. I have another question for you.
Yeah.
Philosophy. You're the chief philosopher, head of philosophy?
Yeah, director, but we're getting rid of those titles, so I'm not sure what I'll be after that. But
Okay.
yeah, essentially, because I was with the company from the beginning. I ran the wholesale division for a long time. I was head of marketing for a couple of different stretches. And I'm a writer by vocation, and I help to tell some of the original Patagonia stories and and to continue to tell the new ones. So essentially, I'm a tribal elder. I teach company history and values to employees. I work several weeks a year at Yale with students who are in a joint program between the business and the environmental schools. And I do a lot of evangelizing for B Corps, for benefit corporations. And that's essentially the nature of being a director of philosophy at Patagonia. So.
I love it. I'm wondering also, and again, please, everybody, anybody, you are welcome to put any questions or remarks in the chat. Vincent, can you tell me a little bit about any of your thinking on the role of dignity in Patagonia, in the company and its products, in regeneration?
Of dignity?
Dignity.
Good question. I think that I hope my answer won't be too long and too roundabout, but I think that the Patagonia culture is very much rooted in the fact that the original employees were climbers and surfers. And so that we didn't have a lot of business values we shared. There's just a feeling, a sense you get when you're a mile from the road and you are feeling the power of nature and feeling your relation to it a little bit small, but also self-reliant and a little bit big. And there's something about that changes your relationship to the whole world, because it's no longer a relationship filtered entirely by social norms. That was one factor, so that there was a sense of common love for wild places. The second thing is that we were all very young and really didn't know what we were doing. We would just take one step and then take another. And so we would sit around a table and say, okay, we're going to go to a trade show, our first trade show. What's a trade show? What do you do? And so we would talk, we would egg each other on, we would work collaboratively. It was very self-organized. And I think when you have an organization that is largely, as much as possible, self-organized, there's a Catholic principle called subsidiarity, Catholic social justice, which calls on people to involve everyone in a decision before that decision is made, everyone who's going to be affected, and to push decisions down as close as possible to the people who are going to be affected. And I think that was part of the culture from the beginning. The third thing I'd say is, long ago we'd be sort of talking around the table about what worked at Patagonia and what didn't work. And one of the things we observed is there weren't a lot of winners at Patagonia. There weren't people with private parking spaces. There weren't people who could walk into a room and say, do this. The other thing that affected the culture is we had on-site childcare from the mid-1980s, and it's really hard to be vice presidential around a 4-year-old. There's a kind of humanity to the culture that allowed people to have their dignity. The other thing I think that's really important is that if you have a sense of community and you have a sense of belonging, which I think people have had at Patagonia, when it's tied to a purpose, tied to a purpose beyond you that you can share with others, but also that reflects your own deepest values, that enhances both dignity and also enhances the organization that's doing the work.
I think that's a great answer. long as it may have been. I see that there are some actually very, very good questions, and I'd actually like to invite Catherine Goldman Schuyler. Are you there? Would you like to ask your question of Vincent?
Sure. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everyone, and welcome, Vincent. So I'm very interested in what's been developing two areas that are related largely, but not too tightly, but I'd love to have you comment on both. One is the greater awareness of the importance of regeneration in what could be called the sustainability now movement on the planet. And also how a small company like Patagonia, compared to some of the giants out there in the world, influences other companies in its industry and or beyond its industry. I know there's been a lot of discussion in that area of sustainability, like what makes a bigger contribution? Is it a pure company like Patagonia, or something, say, like PepsiCo, which isn't, but is trying to influence maybe that people become a little healthier? So if you would weigh in on those two themes, I'd be very interested. Specifically, also concretely, on what Patagonia has been able to do to influence the other companies in its industry.
First to take the relationship between the idea of regeneration and the idea of sustainability. When we wrote the book, The Responsible Company, we used the word responsible rather than sustainable because we were suspicious of the word sustainable. We felt that none of our activities were really sustainable because we weren't giving back to nature as much as we were taking. But anybody could be responsible. You can take ownership of what you're doing. One of the things that I think is interesting now is that sustainability is regarded as kind of on the way to regeneration. It's kind of regarded as a middle way now that that word is starting to be used. But I actually think that the only way that you get to sustainability, which is through regeneration. You don't have systems that have the capability of bringing life to themselves and then continuing themselves in a lively form, unless you first go through this process of regeneration. So that's a little abstract, but I've kind of come away from the thinking that sustainability is on the road to regeneration and that it's the other way around. The second thing that we've done, we worked in two ways to spread the word among other businesses. And the first is we helped create, actually with Walmart in 2011, an organization called Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which now has all the big Gap and Levi's and Nike and Adidas. And the members of this organization make half of all the clothing and footwear sold in the world. It has three purposes. One is to monitor conditions in factories to reduce environmental impact there. The second is to provide information for designers on what are the most socially and environmentally sustainable practices. And the third, which we're hoping to come out, that will come out next year, will be a consumer-facing index. So you can take your cell phone and put it up against a hang tag on a pair of jeans and get an environmental and social rating for that product. And one that's consistent across the industry so you don't have greenwashing or counterclaims. The second thing we've done on the other side, which kind of addresses your question about how far do you go, or does it make more difference that PepsiCo does something, is that we've, for creating down products and wool products, we've created a standard of animal treatment and environmental treatment of the land that's very high, but also incorporates the standard that other manufacturers use. So we try to, if it's something that we can do, we hold to that standard. And we hope that others will join us. We're also working on that for regenerative organic agriculture in general with Rodale, who originally developed the certified organic standard, and with Dr. Bronner's. I think a lot of what sometimes big companies do tends to be not so interesting. But there are, I think, there are some companies that can do one or two things that are really interesting. Nike is absolutely committed to resource efficiency, to minimizing the use of resources in order to create a shoe. Danone, which is the French yogurt, water, and baby food company, is committed to becoming a benefit corporation and has already made its US subsidiary a B Corp. Unilever has several subsidiaries that became benefit corporations, and what they refer to as sustainable brands, about 40 out of 400, they're seeing as contributing half their profits and half their growth. So there are all these spots on the horizon, and what I would encourage anyone to look at is what are they really doing, and then what are the possibilities for replicating that elsewhere.
Thank you. I'm also going to give Anil the opportunity to ask a question. I know his question or her question, Anil, I apologize. When you pop up, I'll know, have a better sense of gender identity if that's important. But you're asking about this intent and commitment of Patagonia's, at least in the past, I'm not sure if it's currently, to contribute 1% of sales for nature as a cost of doing business. Anil, did you want to ask a specific question about that?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I love Patagonia. I've loved it for a very long time, and very, very, very proud of you. Your company being a leader in this space, and I've watched all of Ivan's videos I can lay my hands on. So with that premise, the many, many things I love about your company, but this, what led him to sort of commit that 1% of sales, not profit, or X% of profit, to as a cost of doing business, the way he said, like, this is a natural, what you call, stakeholder in our business. Yeah. So if you could share some more about his thinking, your own thinking, the philosophy, and if so, have you been able to convince others about this 1% of sale rather than percent of profits?
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Yes, we originally made it 10% of profits. That was the first year. And then we decided that our accountants were too clever. And we also, that they might minimize the profit in order to reduce that. And then we also thought, we owe this in bad years as well as good. Right. So every year that we're in business, we've given 1%. And lately we've, in a couple of occasions, we've given far more. We gave back we estimated our tax cut from the corporate tax rate cut last year by to be about $10 million, which we are giving away to grassroots environmental organizations because we didn't think that corporations needed that cut. The original idea was, we didn't know, I think in 1985 or 86, much about what our impacts were on the supply chain, but we knew that what we did polluted. And we essentially imposed that as a tax on ourselves, and have continued to give that money over time as we do today. And we've also forged relationships with groups that are really working hard. A lot of grassroots organizations, very small, working to save a particular patch of land or stretch of water. We started, Yvon and Craig on his own, with a man named Craig Matthews, who's a fly fishing guide in Montana, started an organization called 1% for the Planet in 2000. And that now has, I'm not sure of my numbers, but I think it's over 1,500 members of companies who likewise commit the 1% of sales to environmental causes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
So just to follow on, and I'll ask the question, I know it just came in. What is your sense of whether that 1% reflects a real cost to nature? Is that?
Well, I would think it's not enough. We're now, I think one of the things that we're doing, I think we've sort of stumbled into virtue over the years. We would discover something we were doing and say, no, we don't want to do that anymore. We don't want to do that in the course of business, and we change our practices. Now we're looking proactively, and the biggest impact that we have, by 85% to 90% of our environmental impact, is in materials. And about half of our materials come out of an oil well. A lot of that, maybe 40% of that half, is recycled, made of recycled polyester and nylon, but the rest is virgin. And then when you get to the other half of it, that half comes out of an oil well, the other half comes out of farms. And then when you talk about organic practices, again, you're only talking about not using chemicals. You're not talking about crop rotation or companion planting or reduced tillage and all the other things that lead to soil health. So we haven't calculated what that tax should be. It would be a very difficult calculation, but I can safely say that 1% is not enough. And I think that this is something that business really has to grapple with, that what we have essentially done for the past 150 years is privatize profit and socialize environmental and social costs.
Interesting. Well, thank you, and also for your candor in your response to that question. There's another question that was asked earlier by Emily Aguirre. Are you there? Would you like to ask purpose versus profit and the trade-offs?
Sure, yes, thank you. Thanks so much for being here with us today. So my question has to do with kind of the tension between, say, what some people would call greenwashing and others would call purpose-driven. So if you were going to pitch to someone that you're a purpose-driven company, what factors would you point to convince them that you were genuinely purpose-driven? And then related to that, how do you manage the tension and the trade-offs between purpose and profit, whether on a daily basis or a monthly basis or a yearly basis?
Yeah, those are good questions. On the first one, I think it's one thing to be a purpose-driven company, but the other thing is to ask, what's the purpose? And to identify that. And sometimes the purpose is not entirely to save the world, it's a more modest one. But I think that it's an important word, because what it does, what is underlying the use of that word, is the attempt to connect business activities with human meaning and human values. And I think that's great. But it can also, it's neutral enough that it can be used to skirt the question. So for Patagonia, I think that first of all, for all of our history, we've been concerned and have been active and have helped save and restore habitat for wild creatures. For 25 years, we've been very active and progressive in our activity to reduce our harm in the supply chain. And for the past 10 years, we've been engaged in these regenerative activities. So I think all of those, it's not just a question of whether we're purpose-driven. Those have been the manifestations of our purpose. The other question is interesting to me, because I actually think it's a false dichotomy to talk about it's not a false dichotomy to talk about the tension between purpose and profit, but it is, I think, when you talk about talking about kind of a compromise between purpose and profit. Because if you're thinking that way, profit almost always wins. It's, the double ledger accounting was established by Florentine monks in the 15th century, and that is a tradition we're very comfortable with. It's much less comfortable to talk about our obligations to our other stakeholders, which would be our employers, our employees, our customers, our communities, and nature. And I think what's happened at Patagonia, what's different now, if you had asked me 15 years ago, I would have said that Patagonia culture was kind of divided among different forces, that we had the people who made the products who are working to create the best possible products, and they want to be, 10 years from now, they also want to be ahead of the game. Then you had the tree huggers who are giving that 1% of sales away. And then you also have the accountants or the bean counters who are trying to, keep everybody from giving the farm away. And what happened, I think, was that nobody ever won. All of these different elements in the company couldn't defeat one another. So everything sort of grew almost as if by capillary action. But I think what's happened in the last few years, especially since Rose Macario came on as CEO, is that if I look at a product manager now, she owns what she's responsible for. She knows she has to achieve certain sales goals, certain margin goals. She has to make sure that the R&D is very active and she's going to have the best products 5 and 10 years from now. But she also feels responsible for having more products made with fair trade certified labor, for solving the problem of the durable water repellent that keeps the rain off but persists in the environment. And that's a very different, and her whole team owns that. Nobody's expecting somebody else to slap you on the wrist and to get in line. And that's a very different collaborative and cooperative feeling that's shared broadly in the company. And what that has led to is kind of final, sorry again for a long answer to your question, is that if I look at what our business model is now, not all of it, of course, is regenerative, but almost all of it is based on the fact that self-imposed constraints drive innovation. There's a tendency in business to become more and more efficient every year at what you do, rather than really questioning what you do and saying, okay, is there a better way to do this? And we're forced to do that because of our environmental and social constraints. And those innovations then become the model for our business as it goes into the future. So I don't like the profit versus purpose. I think in this sense, that the purpose is the source of our profit.
I see that Christiane has asked several very insightful questions about mission. And so I'd like to invite Christiane, Andrea, Melina, if you're there, please feel free to ask your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And I believe, well, it's tied to what you just talked about. I wonder what elements could be necessary to help a company like Patagonia fulfill this new mission, especially because when we look at the company, we see leading figures like you and Yvonne, and I'm wondering why maybe other businesses are not following Patagonia's steps, right? And also an additional question is if you are doing or developing practices or any mechanisms so that this mission transcends and continues through time.
Okay. What country, can I ask what country you're in?
Mexico.
Mexico, okay. There is a movement in Latin America called Sistema B that's affiliated with B Corp's B Lab in the United States. And I really advise, I deal with a lot of entrepreneurs who are starting companies, and I really advise entrepreneurs to become a B Corp as soon as possible. Because what it does, first of all, for those who are not familiar with the B Corp movement, just briefly, that benefit corporations it's hard to explain very briefly because there are two kinds of benefit corporations. One is B Corps that are part of a worldwide movement, and the second is benefit corporations that actually have a legal status and write their most deeply held values into their articles of incorporation and their business charter. But what the broad movement of B Corps, every company submits itself to an impartial third-party assessment of its practices every 2 years. And what we found is this is the only really holistic look at everything we do. And when we subject ourselves to this independent assessment, we find out things that we're doing that we wouldn't have found on our own. The second thing that the B Corp movement does is to provide alliances and provide friends, because it's not every business is trying to do what you're trying to do, or trying to do what Patagonia is trying to do. So it's very important to form these alliances and these networks, so that what one person learns, another person can learn.
Thanks. I have another, I think, great question, which I think relates to dignity, but Sunitha, would you like to ask your question? Sunitha, are you there? And if not, I can ask. Sunitha asks, how much does the spirit of playfulness contribute to the culture?
Well, a lot, I think, because again, because people were climbers and surfers originally, people spent a lot of time together, surfing before work, after work, or when the waves were good during work. There's a funny story. During my first year at Patagonia, I was a non-surfer, and so I was the last person in the office and I would answer the phones and take the dealer orders. So that's how I became sales manager. I also used to get a bonus. Anybody, and there were only 2 of us who earned the bonus, anybody who worked 40 hours a week got a bonus, because the climbers would tended to take off Thursday at noon to Yosemite and then roll back into work at Tuesday morning after driving all night. So the sense of play among people who run together or bicycle together or climb together or surf together is very strong. That's as important a bond as at work.
Let's see, I think Ravi, you had a question. Ravi Chinta, are you still on with us?
But by the way, that bonus is no longer offered.
Ah.
Meeting.
So Ravi, I'll ask your question. I'm not sure if you're still here, but I think it's a really interesting point. Apparently there was a documentary called Food Waste on the BBC, and the summary is that everyone on Earth has to do their small bit to attack the problem. And Ravi writes, sustainability and climate change issues are very similar, and therefore focus on single company episodes are, though excellent and excellent narratives, inadequate. And so Ravi comments that the goal is to evangelize everyone on Mother Earth, our home Earth, to attack the problem, and also appreciates what Patagonia is doing. But can you speak to that, evangelism or Patagonia's approach to scaling what you're accomplishing in your regeneration?
There's a tension here. The environmental writer who used to work for the New York Times, Andy Revkin, talked about the need to proceed both very quickly to solve these problems, but also slowly, because one of the conflicts we have with the kind of top-down, the kind of economy that has been controlled by very few corporations with a lot of top-down activity is that you make dumb mistakes. You simplify everything to the point where where essentially what we have done is to drive out the health of the natural world from our social systems. And our social systems are partly as a result of that also extremely strained and in many cases collapsing. So if you talk about regeneration and you talk about a systems approach to solving solutions, and what I mean by a systems approach, it's very similar to regenerative agriculture. If you bring the soil back to health, you provide more delicious food, you provide food that's more nutritious, you need much less water for your farmland, you need far fewer inputs even if they're organic, and you stop polluting the rivers and the oceans. And then when you stop polluting the rivers, you remove the oxygen kills of the plankton, et cetera, et cetera. The knock-on effects of one activity are extraordinary. But that kind of activity tends to be bottom-up rather than top-down. And even though you need massive change on a big scale, you need it to happen, I think, more locally, more intimately. You have to restore a sense of place. You have to have activities that people actually care about intimately, rather than things that they're just sort of told from Big Brother or from the Chinese government, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one of the words I like better than scaling is replicating. And I like the capacity that we've had in the past 15 years with the internet to speak to each other across geographic divides and to learn from one another. But I think that that's the direction that we need to go in, rather than say, okay, everybody's going to be composting by May 1st.
Great. So there's a question that Sylvia Growach has asked, and so I am going to give this question to you on behalf of Sylvia and others. The suggestion is to turn this conversation a little bit in our direction. And are there any questions you have for any of us, or any suggestions? Many of us are researchers in these fields of sustainability, corporate responsibility, ethics, governance, humanistic management.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions for us? Any puzzles? Anything we can help you with?
Yeah, I guess one of the questions I would ask is, what are you seeing in companies from the point of view of humanistic management? And more specifically, I know that a lot of companies have opened up their practices and their processes because they want to they want the engagement and the commitment of their employees. But I'm wondering, does that actually translate into action in the world where the behavior of the corporation is better? I'm curious about that, because often when I hear people talking about transforming organizations, I don't hear that the organizations are then actually doing better things in the world. And I'm wondering if you see a shift.
So I'm going to suggest that if there's someone in the audience, and I can think of a couple people immediately who might have a response right off the top of their head. I know Michael has been in conversation with you quite a bit. JC Spender, I know you may have some ideas as well. And again, I welcome anyone to chime in. Maybe from the chat is easiest, and that way we can maintain a little organization. But JC, do you want to comment on that as a starting point? Are you there?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you, Vincent. Very interesting to listen to you. Michael knows my view is rather dark. Rather than look at what companies are claiming, what they're doing, I guess my first inclination would be to look at what companies are doing to their employees. And I think the news there is almost uniformly bad. And, the things that we thought were peculiar to Japan, death by overwork, I've forgotten what the Japanese term is. There has been a certain amount of correspondence in the New York Times recently about the way that people are having to overwork in order to merely survive. So DINK, double income, no kids, is now DINK, 60 hours a week. So other people might disagree with me, but I think that the first most immediate set of impacts of the evolution of corporate behavior are going to be on the employees. In due course, they ripple out to Mother Nature, and I fear we'll all be long dead before we really understand that. Anyway, so as I say, Michael knows my view is rather dark on this.
And I can add, and it's interesting, some of you may know SLab, which is an initiative with MIT and Otto Scharmer, and I think 300 to 400 basically social change groups out in the world. And one of the themes that I keep hearing over and over again is this idea of starting at the very, very individual level. So if regeneration isn't happening individually, I think it would be difficult for an organization to make that happen. And so, really going back to even what I am very interested in, authenticity. If regeneration is something that a company can or should do, then how are each individual within that organization doing that?
Let me just add to what Erica has just said. I found what you were saying about regeneration and the centrality of that in your thinking to be absolutely of the essence. We have some technical problems, those of us that think about organizations, is that we really have no idea how regeneration works. We have no idea how growth works. Michael knows that I've been spending a lot of time rereading, amongst others, the work of Edith Penrose. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. But she focused, despite much rejection and opposition by other economists, on trying to think about how growth actually occurs. Yeah. And she, I'm sure you would have found her a kindred spirit. So anybody that's really interested in this, I would ask them to look first of all at Edith Penrose's work. So earlier when you were talking, and you were talking about regeneration, I put a little note there that this is really to do with what economists are now calling transaction costs. I think what you were saying to me, maybe because this is what I want to hear, is that unless you understand how you're going to regenerate value that covers the unavoidable frictions of the business, you're not in business. And in business schools, we refuse to think about the frictions, and therefore it's not necessary for us to think about the regeneration that you were talking about. Right. Anyway, I can go on at great length about this.
Also, I think that the social, psychological, environmental cost of running a business transactionally is enormous. And the financial cost of running a business transactionally is enormous, because what you're doing is eliminating the element of trust, you're eliminating the element of meaning, you're eliminating the element of purpose, and reducing a very complex human effort to its mechanics, which, as we all know, we're much more than our skeletons.
So ironically and paradoxically, by squeezing the business using the quasi-scientific nonsense that we develop, we actually crush the ability to regenerate.
Exactly. I mean, and I think a classic example is right now is General Electric, which was for years touted as, in the Jack Welch time, as the perfect example of the Milton Friedman Corporation and the primacy of shareholder value and how you could build an organization out of that. And what you have now is an organization that's failing because it's eating its own tail. It has pursued those marginal gains until the point it can no longer sustain itself without having a real idea of its purpose or the business that it's going to develop over time.
Thanks. So I see Rose has a question, and we only have a few minutes left. So Rose, are you on the call, and would you like to ask your question? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I think it's pretty self-explaining, but I can read it for you if you like. So I would be interested in knowing how did you receive the last news from the IPCC report, and do you believe we can make the drastic changes needed in the 5 to 10 years to save our home planet within the growth paradigm, or should we extract ourselves from this paradigm? And if so, what do you think about degrowth as a possibility, and how could we actually implement degrowth?
That's a very that's a question kind of beyond my I'm interested in, but I don't have an easy answer for. I think when you look at an economy overall, you're going to have some elements that are growing and some elements that are not. And you have to allow for the growth of these new elements that are actually going to create new kinds of activities that are going to be helpful. At the same time, backing off from the abstraction a little bit, we have a kind of crazy economy that's based 75% on sales of disposable items, basically. And no economy in the history of the world has ever been based like that. And it's not one that we need now or one that is sustainable. So from what I've read I'm not sure about what I've read of the degrowth movement, of how much I agree or disagree, but I think the question is critical. And the question raised before by what is the nature of growth? Because the nature of growth doesn't always involve increased sales and increased profits. The nature to grow may mean something different from that as well. That said, at Patagonia, during the years when we didn't grow at all in sales, we never fell back, but we had years where we didn't grow very much. And it was very frustrating for the employees because you couldn't start new projects and you couldn't take on different kinds of work.
So again, we only have a minute or two left, but I am curious if you have a shorter statement about it. How do you measure things like well-being of your people, of your customers, of the communities, of the environment? How do you measure health? How do you measure regeneration? How do you think about that as far as a metric, and is that even appropriate?
I think sometimes it's appropriate and sometimes not. I mean, there are qualitative values that are very difficult to measure and that you should weigh, even when you can't count. But we do identify our greenhouse gas emissions, our electricity usage, our dyes of water, and all that, and work to make changes. So we have a pretty strong quantitative approach at this point. We have chemists working for us who can. Sometimes you have to take a decision, take it down to the molecular level. We can do that from time to time. But I think that those qualitative questions should never be ignored, because I'm not sure I agree that what you can't measure, you can't do, or whatever the saying is. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I see that we are 1 minute away from the end of our meeting together. So I want to take this opportunity on behalf of all of us to thank you so much, Vincent, for joining us today.
And thanks for the questions and for the time, and very much appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you so much. Michael, did you want to add anything as we're closing?
No, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to you, Erica. Thank you to Vincent for doing this. And I want to invite everybody else to just check out the other events that Erica mentioned in the very beginning on our webpage. And Erica, I think you put the link there again, so please check it out on on chat. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye, everybody.